She began her work at first light, the jungle alive around her with the calls of birds, the rustle of unseen creatures, and the constant drip of moisture from the thick canopy above. The sticks she had collected the day before were laid out carefully, sorted by size and strength. Each one had to serve a purpose, whether as a vertical support, a crossbeam, or part of a framework that would hold the weight of leaves and withstand wind and rain. She tested each branch in her hands, flexing it, snapping it lightly against the ground, judging its durability. One wrong choice could cause a collapse later, and in this environment mistakes could be costly. Layer by layer, she began to assemble the skeleton of her shelter. Long sticks were pressed into the soil at precise angles, forming the vertical supports. She lashed them together with vines, twisting and knotting until they held firm. The work was physical and exhausting, but it demanded focus. Her mind was entirely consumed by structure, balance, and tension, her body working in tandem to create something stable from the chaotic resources around her. Each successful connection between branch and vine offered a small surge of confidence, proof that she could manipulate her surroundings to carve out a space for herself. Once the framework was in place, she turned her attention to the walls and roof. Broad, strong leaves were woven into the skeleton, layered thickly to provide shelter from rain and to block wind. She quickly realized that not all leaves were suitable, some were too fragile, tearing under the slightest pressure, while others were damp and heavy, sagging when tied to the frame. Adjusting each leaf, testing it, and repositioning it became a meticulous process, one that required patience and constant observation. Her fingers grew sore, her arms ached, but the rhythm of the work brought focus, a sense of control in a place where chaos seemed to rule. As she worked, the jungle continued to assert its presence. Mosquitoes and ants swarmed persistently, forcing her to brush, swat, and adjust her movements constantly. Even as she focused on her shelter, she could not ignore the faint shimmer of a snake slithering through the leaves or the low rustle of a small mammal nearby. Every sound, every movement demanded her attention. She learned to work carefully, to move deliberately, to anticipate both the challenges of the materials and the unpredictability of the environment. Hours passed, the sunlight shifting through the canopy and casting moving patterns across the forest floor. By mid-afternoon, a crude but functional shelter had begun to emerge. The framework was sturdy, the roof thick enough to shield her from light rain, and the walls layered to block wind and minimize insects. It was far from perfect. Gaps remained, and some branches bent under weight, but it was a livable space. She stepped back, wiped sweat from her brow, and allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. For the first time, she had transformed the raw resources of the jungle into something that could protect her, a personal foothold in a wild, untamed world. The jungle still demanded respect, but now she had carved out a small corner where survival felt possible, tangible, and real. As she worked on assembling her shelter, the jungle seemed determined to test her patience at every turn. Branches she thought strong enough snapped unexpectedly under the pressure of her weight or when tied to another support, forcing her to pause, reassess, and find replacements. Some sticks appeared sturdy until she lifted them, only to hear a sharp crack as the fibers split, leaving her scrambling to adjust the framework before it collapsed entirely. Each failure was a harsh reminder that in the jungle, even small miscalculations could have consequences, and that survival demanded constant attention and adaptation. The leaves she planned to use as roofing and walls presented their own challenges. Wet from the morning dew and occasional drizzle, they were heavier and more fragile than they appeared. As she tried to weave them into place, some tore under the tension, while others refused to stay secured on the framework. She had to layer them carefully, overlapping edges to prevent gaps, and frequently reposition them to maintain coverage. Rain began to fall intermittently, soaking her clothes and the leaves she worked with, making them heavier and more cumbersome. The sticky mud underfoot slowed her movement, turning every step into a careful calculation, lest she slip or dislodge part of the structure she had worked so hard to secure. The jungle itself seemed to conspire against her, its humidity pressing down and making every physical task more exhausting. Sweat dripped into her eyes, causing stinging irritation, and the constant presence of insects made her flinch repeatedly. Mosquitoes buzzed at her face relentlessly, biting through her damp clothing, while ants scurried along the ground and vines, occasionally delivering sharp, painful stings. She had to pause frequently to brush them away, rubbing at bites and swatting the persistent insects that seemed drawn to her every movement. It was a battle of endurance as much as skill, testing both her body and her focus in equal measure. Despite the setbacks, she adapted. When a branch broke, She reinforced it with additional sticks, twisting vines tightly to add support. Torn leaves were layered over multiple times, creating a thicker, more durable barrier that could withstand further rain. She experimented with angles, adjusting the slope of the roof to allow water to run off rather than pool, and reshaped walls to prevent sagging. Every problem forced her to improvise and learn, teaching her not only the mechanics of building a shelter, but the patience and creativity required to survive in such an unforgiving environment. As the day wore on, she could see her efforts taking shape. The shelter, though imperfect, began to feel solid and functional. She stepped back frequently, assessing weak points and imagining how it would hold during a night of heavy rain or the unexpected arrival of larger animals. The sense of struggle and adaptation gave her a deep respect for the jungle's power and a growing confidence in her own ability to meet it. By evening, drenched, exhausted, and scratched from branches and undergrowth, she realized that every snapped stick, torn leaf, and soaked vine had been a lesson. The difficulties she faced were not just obstacles. They were essential training, shaping her skills, resilience, and determination to survive in a world that demanded nothing less than full attention and ingenuity. The relentless insects of the jungle quickly became one of her most persistent and challenging foes. From the moment the sun pierced the canopy, mosquitoes swarmed around her, buzzing insistently and finding any exposed skin they could bite. Tiny ants crawled along the forest floor, scuttling up her legs and arms with painful little stings, while flies and gnats darted in and out of her line of sight, their constant presence a maddening distraction. She realized early that simply building a shelter would not be enough. She needed to learn how to protect herself from the jungle's smallest, yet most insistent inhabitants. At first, she tried swatting and brushing them away, but the insects were relentless. No matter how many she repelled, more would appear, forcing her to rethink her approach. She quickly learned to observe patterns, the way mosquitoes congregated near damp areas, how ants traveled in precise lines across the forest floor, and which leaves and branches attracted or repelled certain bugs. With careful observation, she began to devise improvised strategies to reduce their impact. Mud became a natural barrier smeared across exposed skin to deter bites, while thick leaves and vines were layered strategically around her shelter to create zones that were less penetrable by insects. Her first attempts at protective barriers were crude, often failing under the weight of rain or shifting branches. Layers of leaves collapsed or shifted, allowing ants to infiltrate the very areas she was trying to defend. She adapted again, weaving vines tightly to anchor leaves more securely, and creating makeshift walls and partitions that could withstand movement and weight. Each failure taught her something new: how to reinforce weak points, how to choose the right leaves for coverage, and how to position her body and belongings within the shelter to minimize exposure. The insects, while maddening, forced her to develop patience, resourcefulness, and ingenuity. Working against these tiny, persistent adversaries also taught her mindfulness and attention to detail. Every movement had to be deliberate. She learned to avoid sudden gestures that could provoke swarms, and to focus on one problem at a time while staying aware of the environment around her. She discovered that the jungle's smallest inhabitants could dictate her behavior, but that by observing and responding intelligently, she could mitigate their attacks without becoming overwhelmed. This constant negotiation with the environment sharpened her survival instincts and forced her to develop strategies that went beyond mere construction of a shelter. It was about creating a livable space that accounted for every threat, no matter how small. By the end of the day, she had crafted a more secure, insect-resistant shelter. Mud, vines, and layered leaves now formed protective barriers that reduced the intrusion of mosquitoes and ants, giving her a reprieve from the relentless assault. Exhausted, itchy, and smeared in mud, she stepped back and examined her work. The jungle's insects had tested her patience, resilience, and creativity, but she had learned to adapt. What had begun as an irritating and almost overwhelming problem had become an opportunity to understand the nuances of the environment and to assert some control over a space that was entirely wild. In surviving their onslaught, she gained not only protection, but also a deeper understanding of how to coexist, at least temporarily, with the relentless energy of the Amazon. Each challenge she faced while building her shelter became a lesson in resilience, patience, and adaptation. Every snapped branch, torn leaf, or leaking section of her roof was a reminder that the jungle did not forgive mistakes, and that survival required constant attention, trial, and error. When a branch broke unexpectedly, sending part of her framework collapsing with a harsh crack, she could feel her heart leap in panic. But the failure also forced her to pause, assess the problem, and figure out how to correct it. She realized quickly that improvisation was essential. There was no blueprint, no manual to guide her through these obstacles. Every setback became a teacher, shaping her understanding of how to construct a shelter capable of withstanding the elements and the unpredictability of the environment. Tears and frustration often accompanied these moments. Leaves ripped as she tried to weave them into the roof, forcing her to layer more than she initially planned. Wet vines slipped from her grasp, undoing hours of careful work. Rain began to drizzle intermittently, soaking everything she touched, making sticks heavier and leaves more fragile. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally. She had to adapt, finding ways to reinforce the weaker parts of her structure and reposition leaves to prevent water from pooling. Each small failure required focus and patience, and over time, she learned to anticipate weaknesses before they became disasters. Through this process, she developed an intimate understanding of the materials she was working with. She learned which sticks could bear weight, which vines held knots best, and how to overlap leaves to create a roof that would resist rain. Every correction she made, every adjustment, honed her survival skills and built confidence. The jungle demanded more than brute strength. It demanded observation, creativity, and an ability to think ahead. She realized that mistakes were inevitable, but they were not fatal if she responded intelligently. Trial and error became her teacher, and the lessons it offered were invaluable. Even as the day wore on, she faced unexpected complications. A sudden gust of wind toppled part of the partially completed roof, forcing her to rebuild a section she had thought finished. Ants infiltrated her layered leaves, reminding her that the jungle's challenges extended beyond structure and weather. Each encounter reinforced that survival required holistic awareness. Accounting for every factor, no matter how small, she began to see her shelter not as a static project, but as a living part of the environment, one that needed constant adjustment, attention, and maintenance. By evening, as light faded through the dense canopy, her shelter had taken shape. It was far from perfect, but it was functional, and she could rest inside with a sense of relative safety. Every snapped branch, every torn leaf, every patch she had rebuilt was a symbol of her perseverance and growing knowledge of the jungle. Through trial and error, she had transformed raw, unpredictable materials into a space that could protect her, demonstrating that mistakes were not the end, but an essential part of learning to survive. The jungle was unforgiving, but it had taught her resilience, patience, and the ability to turn obstacles into victories, shaping her into someone capable of enduring the days ahead. By the time evening settled over the jungle, she stepped back to take in what she had accomplished, and a quiet sense of triumph washed over her. The shelter, though rudimentary, now stood as a testament to her determination and resourcefulness. The framework of sticks was stable, the leaves layered thickly enough to block rain and wind, and the vines held the structure together despite the humidity and occasional gusts of wind. It was not perfect, and she knew it would need constant maintenance, but it was a livable space. A small sanctuary carved out of a wild and unpredictable environment. The realization that she had created something functional from nothing filled her with a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced before. Exhaustion pressed heavily on her body. Her arms were sore from twisting and tying vines, her hands were scratched from branches, and sweat clung to her skin in the thick humidity. Yet even as fatigue set in, a feeling of pride persisted. Each laborious step, the testing of sticks, the layering of leaves, the improvisation against insects and rain, was a victory over the chaos of the jungle. She had taken control, however small, of a world that seemed intent on overwhelming her, and in doing so, she had claimed a measure of security. Inside the shelter, she arranged a small area to lie down, using extra leaves to create padding against the damp ground. She paused, listening to the jungle around her. The evening sounds, the distant calls of monkeys, the rustle of leaves, the drip of condensation no longer seemed purely threatening. They became part of the rhythm of her new reality, a background to the quiet accomplishment of having a place to rest. For the first time since entering the jungle, she felt a moment of calm, a sense that she had achieved something tangible despite the overwhelming challenges surrounding her. This sense of accomplishment extended beyond the physical structure. Building the shelter had tested her patience, her problem-solving, and her resilience. Every failure, broken branches, torn leaves, gaps in the roof had been an opportunity to learn, to adapt, and to improve. By the end of the day, she understood that survival in the jungle required both physical skill and mental perseverance. The act of creating a livable space was a powerful affirmation of her ability to endure, to face obstacles, and to transform adversity into achievement. As darkness deepened and the temperature began to drop slightly, she settled inside her newly completed shelter, muscles aching but spirit buoyed. She realized that this first major success, her shelter, was more than just protection from the elements. It was proof that she could survive, that she could adapt, and that she could carve out a small piece of order in an otherwise untamed world. The sense of accomplishment was electric, a quiet confidence that carried her through the night. She had secured a place to rest, to plan, and to recover, and with that she felt a renewed determination to face whatever challenges the jungle would present in the days to come.